Once again, we welcome you to today's webinar. This is Sustainability Strategies, Your Audience. This webinar is brought to you by ATE Central. Joining us today is Nancy Marin with Ithaca SNR, Program Director for Sustainability and Scholarly Communications. Also joining us is Rachel Bauer with University of Wisconsin-Madison, Principal Investigator with ATE Central. Welcome, Nancy and Rachel.
Great to be here.
Great to be here as always.
Great, let's go ahead and get started. Rachel?
Whoops, we just saw some pictures of us. Unfortunately, I seem to be, there we go. All right, can everybody hear me okay? All right, I just want to tell you a little bit about ATE Central. ATE Central acts as a sort of information hub for the ATE grantees and the ATE community. Our primary purpose is really to amplify the impact of ATE. We have an information hub and an online portal. We also have a really large resource collection that contains records not only about the resources created by ATE grantees, but also about the projects and centers themselves. And we have a whole suite of tools and services that we've developed, including this series of sustainability support and sustainability training opportunities, like the webinar we're all on today. So we really try to make these kinds of services community-driven. This particular set of sustainability training opportunities were done in response to a needs survey we did in 2011. And really the top need that PIs identified was more support in the area of sustainability. So we worked with Nancy and the folks at Ithaca to come up with this set of workshops and webinars. This is the second in our spring webinar series. Nancy will tell you a little bit about the next webinar that we have available. So let's go ahead and get started. I'm going to turn things over to Nancy.
Thanks, Rachel. And as always, it is a pleasure to be here. It's really been a wonderful relationship that we've had with Rachel and with the folks at ATE Central, and more with all of you. I'll tell you by way of beginning just a couple words about Ithaca. I'm hoping that by next year, all of you on the webinars will be so bored by this slide because you will be well familiar with us. But as I think there are still new folks attending, I'll give you a little background. Ithaca itself is a not-for-profit organization. It was really created when JSTOR was created. It was created around JSTOR, which many of you may know. It's a major content database, specifically journal articles, and really mostly in the humanities and social sciences, although there's really quite a bit of everything in there. But figuring out how to launch that project pretty much from nothing based on a great idea in about 1995, the folks who were part of that original team realized that it would be really valuable to help others figure out how to launch, and not just launch, but actually sustain over the long term other initiatives that were being launched in the academic sector and even in the cultural heritage sector. Let's just say places where business models aren't always the first thing you think of. So out of that notion, from JSTOR grew to SNR, which is a consultancy and a research group. And we really focus on a range of things now, and even that's expanding to cover some of the bigger questions facing higher education. But the piece I've worked on has had to do specifically with sustaining these great new initiatives. So we look at business models and we try to figure out how you can actually apply business principles to initiatives that are taking place in academia. Portico is our digital preservation service. For all intents and purposes, a little bit less relevant today, but of course we'll mention them. As Rachel pointed out, this is the webinar today is the second in a series of 3 webinars we'll be doing this spring. The next one coming up is on partnerships. In a lot of ways, some of the ideas we cover today, you'll see how those work in practice when we talk about partnerships. We understand how important the idea is to many of the projects, and particularly the centers. And we also know that partnership itself is a terrible word because it masks all kinds of different things. Some things look like business transactions and some are really partnerships of equals. And we'll take a little time to talk about the different flavors that can come in and share some examples from the community about best practice for developing partnerships that will last. The goal of today's webinar is really to familiarize you with the basics of understanding your audience. We see this as a really key topic on the path to sustainability. Today's webinar is going to encourage you to think hard about defining that audience and to even push you maybe past where you've gone already in terms of how fine-grained that understanding is. It's going to help you think about ways that you can, once you know who the audience consists of, to learn more about them and what their needs are. And finally, we'll share some case studies and best practices for outreach and recruitment, as we know that these are some of the things that are the very practical application that you all need for your initiatives to be successful. So the agenda for today will include a beginning on just explaining how we see audience as central to sustainability, a unit on how well you know your audience, different ways to think about audience, a section on ways to understand them better, and finally on tactics. So we'll start right off by seeing how this polling system is working. Rachel, do you want to kick us off with the first poll question?
Absolutely. So our first poll question is, for my project or center, my primary audience consists of A, students, B, educators, C, industry, and D, other. So I see you guys are already starting to put some answers in. Remember, you're going up to that little icon up at the top left. Oh, there we go. Everybody's getting stuff in. And if you'd like, feel free, if you ticked D as an other, which so far nobody has, but if you do tick that, you're welcome to put that audience in the chat window. So just a few more seconds here. It looks like maybe everybody who's going to fill, oh, we got another, yay! So maybe somebody can put whatever they consider that other in the chat window for us. Look, there we go. So here are our results. Nancy, do you want to take a look at those?
Like students and educators are running neck to neck. We have an equal split, really, pretty much, with about 8 respondents saying that students are the primary audience, 9 saying that it's educators, and actually 3 indicating industry, which is really interesting. In fact, I feel like I would love already to schedule follow-up conversations, especially with those 3. I'm not sure who the what the other is. And I'm wondering, this is maybe just a moment for a sound check. I hope that the sound is working.
Yeah, I think you sound better now to me, Nancy. Can we get some? Okay. It's saying that's better.
All right, this is an ongoing effort to get this right. Okay, thank you, everybody.
It sounds much better now, Nancy. That's better.
And I have to say, this is, again, an unfair question in many cases. We've heard from so many of you just about how it's very difficult to separate out students from educators, although clearly the intention of this is to underline that the strategies, obviously, for both and understanding both are going to be slightly different.
All right, well, this is great information. Let's move on to our second poll. So poll question number 2 is asking what your main concern is at the moment. And this is, of course, related again to audience, but attracting more students to a class would be A. B, getting instructors to adopt curriculum that you've developed. C would be encouraging other forms of participation. Or D, other. And you're welcome with either C or D to put that information in the chat box. All right, let's see. Those are happening pretty quickly.
Yeah, we would love to hear more. I mean, there's a lot of people in C, and I totally get that. A and B, attracting students into a class or into a program and getting instructors to adopt curriculum, seem to be things that were so specific, and yet they came up so many times. But I'm not at all surprised to see a lot of, yeah, tell me, yeah.
We have recruiting more females into non-traditional STEM fields. Somebody just put that in the chat box. So that's getting a specific audience into those non-traditional STEM fields. recruiting high school CTE teachers to work together on problem-based learning.
That's great. And so, you know, the different flavors that this will take on obviously will have everything to do with your specific motives, but you can get the idea that the common strain through these is essentially, you know, targeting a very specific audience and finding ways to get them to do something, not so much getting them to do something you'd like to do, but because you know that there's an issue out there, figuring out how you can really address it the best way, in the best way possible. So let's move on. This has been interesting. These are kinds of questions that, trust me, are way more fun when we're all there sitting around a table. They're very hard to do in a survey, and well, we'll talk about more about that kind of tactic later. So how is audience the key to sustainability? You know, I'll first give the kind of generic definition that I've been using for what sustainability is. And of course, just to complicate it, we'll show something green on the side, although you know we're not really talking about ecological sustainability so much as we're talking about an ongoing cycle of support. So sustainability, the way we see it, is a way to generate or gain access to the resources. And when we say resources, we know that can be a lot of things. It can be money, it can be people's time, and it can be lots of in-kind contributions. All those resources that are needed in order to protect the value you've already created and also to invest so you can increase the value of whatever your product or service or center is. And the last phrase there, you want to increase the value for those for whom it is intended, is going to be a critical part of the webinar today. So your sustainability plan, when you come and develop it, is really going to be this evidence-based strategy for how you're going to get those resources attracted to your center or project over time. The key here is really that it is a cycle of ongoing support and investment that starts, if you look at the top, with being informed by external factors, like again, who your audience is and what's going on in the environment outside your initiative. So by external, we really mean external to your grant. Obviously the grants are well conceived and they're based on sound evidence that there's a need out there. But we also know that people's needs change and the external environment changes, whether it's because of government, because of changes in industry, and any number of factors. So because those things change, even a great grant proposal from a few years back, you know, will require some attention to where the shifts will need to take place. That star at the center, I'll draw your attention to, is really, that is the value proposition of your project or center, of those great activities or deliverables that you have. You want to think about the thing that your project or center really does better than anybody else. And then all paths to sustainability are tied to your ability to do that, whether it's impact for your audience or impact for other kinds of stakeholders. In some cases, it might be a host institution, and we know it's also funders. So here's a little sketch of what that cycle might look like put into action. Let's imagine that you have this successful program or initiative, project or center. We're starting to think about how this might all lead to a successful sustainability plan. So here's just a schematic, and then we'll show some examples. A great or successful program is going to meet the needs of its audience. It's going to help beneficiaries do something they maybe couldn't do otherwise, do it in a way that's particularly enjoyable or satisfying, or maybe just does it better than others, better or cheaper or faster than others. There's all kinds of ways that you can be distinguished from other things, other competitive aspects in the field. But so assuming you're doing that, there's all kinds of wonderful things that can flow from that. One outcome could be that you have more students and faculty won over to your cause. You may have more volunteers coming in. The little picture of the building is meant to represent institutional support or funder support that might come as a result of your successes. And finally, it opens up the pathway to other sorts of program-related income, including could be registration or membership fees, could actually be sales of other services and products. So here's a little example of how this can work. Those of you who have met me before know that I love this example. This is not, in fact, an ATE project or center, but it's a digital initiative out of the Cornell Lab of Ornithology. Just a great teaching example, so we'll start with that. But I also know there are great examples in your community as well, and I'll definitely highlight those as well. So this particular initiative is an online database of birding observations where literally an amateur birder can go into the field, say that they saw a few robins and a couple of jays, enter it into their own personalized checklist, and then store it in this database. And there's all kinds of bells and whistles which have attracted thousands and thousands of birders who submit millions of observations every year. There's all kinds of work that has gone into making this as successful as it is, and I'll just cut to the chase. A lot of what they did was to spend time understanding their audience, the birding community, to figure out what would really drive that participation. They knew that the ornithologists in the academy would love the data, but what they didn't know at first was how the birders were going to want to play along. Why would they want to contribute to an academic project? So at the end of the day, they had figured out, by dealing very closely with the birding community and bringing in some birders to advise them, they figured out ways to give them all kinds of checklists and, like I said, bells and whistles that really made it appealing. So they gained a certain amount of traction in the field. So what are these great outcomes? They found they had academic researchers who were able to use the data to conduct research on bird migration. They have professionals in other fields using the data for things like land use planning and ecological studies. They even found that nature centers wanted to lease the platform to customize it for their visitors. So there are so many different groups of people who found this valuable, and this led to wonderful outcomes and terrific examples of impact. So for example, these large numbers of bird watchers started to be a very interesting audience, which helped eBird attract corporate sponsorship through an optics manufacturer. The academic researchers are publishing significant findings, and this actually reinforces the importance as a scholarly resource, which helps get new grant funding and other kinds of support from Cornell. Nature centers around the world value the eBird platform, and they're willing to pay in order to customize and lease it for their local use. So this happy story ends up fueling the cycle. These terrific outcomes and evidence of impact permits there to be an ongoing investment into whatever the next generation is going to need to be. It can be software upgrades. In their case, it was app development. It can be more user-focused research to understand what those changes will be. But the logic is that a deep investment into what the users need and how they need it provides a virtuous cycle of support, and that's what we hope for all of you. An example, with fewer arrows, but I can talk you through it anyway, an example from your area is MATE, the Marine Advanced Technology Education National Partnership, a national center. I've been speaking with one of its PIs, Deirdre Sullivan, and just the more I learn about this, I'm still learning more. It's another terrific example of how this cycle can work. So for example, these folks started off years ago focused on workforce development, and the idea was how can they help people in the field to be at the top of their field and learn what they needed to learn. By hosting workshops, and it was a pretty basic first step, by hosting a series of workshops, one of the things that came out of that was an understanding that one of the problems facing the educators was getting the word out to students. And again, I think that's something that everyone here, many of you here have in common. This led to a discussion with those folks and a brainstorming to figure out how they could get out to reach more students. And this ultimately, I believe, led to the idea of these national competitions. And for them, a competition means like a marine remotely operated vehicle. So this is like every year they send out a challenge, and they'll have student teams come up with trying to design the vehicles that can compete with this challenge. So it's become an annual event that is much looked forward to. The numbers have grown. This has helped to attract some revenue from the event itself, some revenue from corporate sponsors, and all other kinds of interesting spin-offs, including a sideline where they actually sell starter kits to actually build the machines. So this combination of things, this investment early on in this deep understanding of what was needed and what would work, has really helped them to build up what looks to me like a virtuous cycle of support. One of the things that Deirdre said that I felt I wanted to point out was she stressed to me how important it was to understand what those needs are for your key audience and to really establish an ongoing connection, not just with a one-shot project or program, but some kind of an ongoing reason for them to come back again and again. What can you do better than anyone else that people will continue to come back to you for? And so what that means, again, is not just doing an excellent competition or an excellent training course, but figuring out what the next training course would be for them or what the next textbook or kit would be. And so this is an ongoing work of research that they do every year. Anyway, back to the cute little chart, just to reinforce. You're starting with an investment in creating anything you need to have a successful program or initiative. If it's doing the things you hope it is doing, it is in a position to spin off all sorts of support, whether it's people support, whether it's institutional support, whether it's pure financial support. So careful attention to meeting those audience needs opens up tons of pathways to sustainability. It's just the one thing you can't skip. So I'll take a pause right here and ask if there are any questions.
It looks like, Nancy, we have one question. Isn't more, as in more students, a relative number? Is the first question we have.
Yeah, and that's a great question. There is no right number, at least there's not any right number that I could mention that would apply to all of your specific projects. We're not going to do a lot today on market sizing, but it's a piece of what we would do in a longer investigation of this question. If you have, in a certain field, having 100 people might be getting to 98% of your target population, and that number might be great. In other fields, 100 people wouldn't be so impressive if you figured out that your target population is many hundreds of thousands. So I will admit that at some point I've seen reports back to funders that have said things like, we had 400% growth. And then you realize that that's possible because the numbers were like, we went from 2 to 8 instead of numbers that are really, really substantial and tied to what those ultimate goals are. So I would have to suggest that your numbers have to be tied to your understanding of how big that market is and what piece of it you feel you need to own in order for you to have delivered on your goals.
Nancy, I just got a second question about how early folks should start defining their audience in the grant writing process.
Sure. I mean, I would imagine that everyone has had the feet to the fire about doing this in the grant writing process. And I've read a lot of grants that have been funded and that are very good and important projects, where I might still have encouraged the grant writers to push themselves even more to do that quantification piece and really figure out who actually they're talking about, how many there are, and what the likelihood of that audience participating would be. Very often it's easy to participate in a kind of a wishful thinking of, let me imagine all the possible stakeholders or audience segments who might like what I'm doing. And there's nothing wrong with that, but the next step is, how will I get to them and how likely are they to really do this thing? Yeah, I can't think of an example of anyone I want to share publicly right now, but it's the difference between saying, look, I've listed 20 different potential audiences, from people in my field to people who really like the subject to people who once said this word, And just adding up those raw numbers is not a deep enough approach. So the answer is early, early in the process. So how well do you know your audience? So poll question number 3. Rachel, do you want to kick us off with our next couple of poll questions?
Sure. So we have a couple more poll questions for you. The first is, and these are both true-false ones. They're a little bit easier than our last. So the first one is, I know how large our primary target audience is and how to find them. True or false? All right, here we go. Getting there. All right, I think we might be ready for some results. More there. Wow.
So
it's a fairly
Rachel, can you interpret? Yeah. Is the X is the A?
The X is false. The X must be
false. Okay.
No, check true.
Oh, I see it. It actually, wow, that's a very fancy system. Okay, so and that's even more interesting, right? Because I apologize, guys. I didn't realize we had all these options for the choices on these toggles, but this is great. Right. So I guarantee that you all know a bit about the audience in general, and the trick is figuring out how far you can go to defining it. So some examples would be. If you're on campus and it's a project-based thing, and you know that your mandate is really just as big as your campus, can you find out fairly easily how many potential students could come into the program in a year? That's a number you can find. It's once you start to go broader than that, wow, this is an interesting subject, and actually I think this would be relevant in my region, not just my institution. That gets a little trickier. And those of you thinking nationally and into other kinds of sectors, even more complicated. So I'm glad that folks were being so candid. Maybe this is would be a great subject actually to do as a kind of a full workshop if we get a chance to do something like that. Let's look at the next question.
All right, so our final poll question is, I know why our primary audience comes to us and why we are important to them. So this is sort of getting to that value piece. That you know why they come to you, and that you have a good sense of why the deliverables, the activities are critical to them. This one seems to be shaping up slightly differently. So a couple more seconds here.
I'm fascinated by this. This is, again, this would be a great conversation because a lot of people, if I'm reading these numbers right, a lot of people say that they actually feel very comfortable with understanding this.
All right, let's get the results of that one up. So that's very different than the last one. People are saying they are much more comfortable, that they feel like they know a lot more about why the primary audience comes to them and why what they're doing is important to them.
Right, and
so
let
me see. There's a comment in here too. Hold on, Nancy. In determining a target audience, keeping an eye on other potential audiences is important too. When considering sustainability, is there any guidance you can provide in getting balance between being alert to new potential audiences and mission creep that will dilute your efforts and possibilities of sustaining components of your work? And it's interesting because we also got another question about this that's very similar, which is, why might it be important to look beyond our primary audience and discover secondary audiences? And Elaine was just asking about the danger of looking out at those secondary ones and potentially having diluting your efforts.
Yeah, and in fact, I think Elaine is one of the phone calls I wished I'd made before this webinar. I have a feeling you have a lot to share with us on some of these questions. But I will say that we actually, in the next couple of slides, I would actually very much encourage people to do an exercise that involves, in a first instance, blue skying. How high could you go? how relevant could this be to how many people? What's the best case scenario for what that looks like at your institution, at institutions like yours, possibly in some cases out to the general public if it's relevant. That's the first instance, and I think that can be a very liberating exercise, but it has to be kind of closely followed by the limiting exercise, which says, okay, let's look very realistically at what it would take to get to those other audiences and what the potential benefit to us would be. Once you do that second piece of the analysis, you'll have a better sense of if it's worth even going after. There was an example that comes to mind is a project I worked with that had to do with jazz discography. So very specialized subject-wise, very specialized in the kind of content. Both of these are like, you know, niches of niches of niches. And the question was, should this be an initiative that is just interesting for music librarians or jazz music librarians? Or do you think jazz lovers would benefit from this too? Because if you imagine the size of that audience, much, much bigger. At the end of the day, for the time being, they realized that they had to really zero in on just jazz scholars and jazz librarians, music librarians, because that bigger audience, while extremely tempting, was going to be extremely difficult to reach and without obvious benefit. In terms of mission creep, I think that's a set of questions too that you'd weigh it against. But I think this would be, again, like another great kind of area to explore with a bunch of people, because I think that this is, it really drives to the question of which ones are worth scaling and what are the most natural next audiences to look at to try to do that. So how well do you know your audience? We've already touched on a couple of these things, but this is just my list of the way I think of the categories. You know, one way to think about audience is just how many students in a course, in an internship, in a workshop, number of institutions you may be partnering with, number of faculty who are using the curriculum, number of downloads of materials or purchases of materials. So those are basic. I have a feeling many of you just do that as a matter of course. It gets a little harder as you go down the list. You know, the next kinds of questions are really not how many, but the who, what, and why. So who exactly are they? If they're students, that's easy, but if they're not students, or even if they are, you know, what do we know about the ages, where they are in life, what their backgrounds are? And again, in your case, you may know quite a bit. I think a lot of the programs are targeted at this. Going down the list, behaviors. In what ways are they engaging with your program? Again, in your case, in the case of many of these initiatives, when you're having a person in a room or in a workshop, that might be a little bit easier to understand as well. It's a little harder when there's some web-based interaction, and those are harder to gauge without further investigation. But the one thing I insist on, I think it's the hardest to know and probably the most important to know, is the attitudes and motivations. What is it that's really driving people to participate? What value do they find in doing that? What is it exactly that your project or center or a product or service that you're developing is doing for them that nothing else can do? So when we're talking about audience, we're going to actually take a minute and go through this little spreadsheet just to give you a sense of how you might systematically ask yourself these questions. And the first question is really, and this is, I guess, to Elaine's point, how many audiences are we talking about? Is it just the primary one, the one we care about, or are there others? So this is just a way to think about the kinds of audiences you might want to focus on. Today, in this instance, we're really going to zero in on what we're thinking of as direct beneficiaries, and that's the people who have an immediate benefit from the actual thing you're developing. So there I'm thinking of, these can be students on campus who are matriculated, these might be programs they're taking, this might be adult or continuing education, but they're the people who directly engage. Could be faculty. Industry partners and the host institution are super important as well. It's absolutely relevant for this exercise, but it's a little bit different. So for right now, we're really focusing on the direct beneficiaries of your initiatives. So This may be another point for a quick break. Are there any other questions folks have?
Nancy, I have a couple more here. Somebody raised the issue of thinking about NSF as a sort of audience. Is that something that you think people should be considering?
Yeah, that is so interesting. Well, they're definitely the audience for the grant proposal. and right, I mean, and that is undeniable. And when we all write grants, and I write them too, you have to please the funder and the panel who's going to be reviewing it. But at the end of the day, what is going to make the project or center really important and relevant is how well you are delivering some value to these end users. And you'd like to think that if you deliver on that, and if you do a great job delivering the value to your end users, that will kick up all kinds of metrics that you then go back and share with the funder, who in turn will be pleased. But I almost wonder if there's a little bit too of the phrase used before of mission creep, if the focus is too much on pleasing a funder instead of delivering on what that initial mission was. You hope that they're always aligned, sometimes less so. I hope that helps.
Yeah, that's great. I think one other question too was somebody just messaged me and asked how often they should survey their audience. And if they have multiple audiences, should they have different surveys to understand unique needs? And I know you and I have talked a lot about the sort of issue of surveying versus interviewing, and this may be something you're going to get to in a little bit, but that is a question that's popped up. Should we hold off on that one?
Well, I can give you the quick overview. We'll have time to catch up on this a bit more later, but in the instances of the PIs who seem to have figured out a few things, it always ends up sounding like this is just an ongoing learning process. Meaning that there are multiple ways that they are gaining feedback from their audience. It can be actual evaluations in programs or events, but there are also a lot of other things. There might be workshops built in or focus groups built in, and the surveying is fine. We'll talk about the differences between surveying and other kinds of information gathering a bit later, but you're going to find that there are some things that you won't get at with a simple survey. Surveys are great for quantitative information. For getting at the attitudes and the unmet needs, you may find conversations with people to reveal a lot more, kind of in a deeper way. So, and in terms of the timing of it, you know, I don't know that there's an actual answer to this. I suspect that evaluation-wise, there might be annual objectives where you have to do it every year. But I think the point is to make sure that there are, you know, at least a couple of ways that you're gaining this feedback in an ongoing way. So let me share this spreadsheet with you. You may well have seen this before, but this just gives us a chance to talk through some of the issues just raised. And it's a tool that we hope that you will use. Here it's just a slide, but ATE Central, I believe, has this in Word form. So we'd be happy for you to use it, download it, play around with it. Essentially, once you've already come up with your hypothesis, who you think your audience is, we'd encourage you to use a form like this to kind of blue sky or brainstorm with yourself or with your team to figure out how you might identify additional audiences. Now, just for facility's sake, we broke this into things like end users, industry partners, and host institutions. But actually, I think even just sticking with end users, you get pretty far. I'll show you a bit about how this can work. Among other things, using the spreadsheet, we think is a way to kind of force the question of how ambitious can we set our targets for that audience. We hope it will help you surface new potential segments. And most important, we're hoping it's going to help you to force the question of how valuable are those segments, and is it really going to be worth our time to go there? It may also kind of surface the difference between what end users need and other kinds of indirect beneficiaries who are equal, important for other things, just a different animal. So I'll mention quickly another case study, which is Vesta. And this was interesting for us because of Michelle's approach to different audience segments. So you guys may know this example better than I do, but just for a quick overview, Vesta is a center that provides training and all kinds of support for programs for the wine and grape industry. So I think viticulture and enology is the official term. And what's interesting is kind of how this originated. So I believe they started in 2003. There was a sense that there was a real unmet need. So I think this was a collection of institutions, I believe it was Southern Illinois, Northeast Iowa, Missouri State, came together, realized that right now, at that point, if people wanted to understand and study the subject, the only game in town was really in California. So this initiated through a plan to actually meet that need. There are all kinds of ways that they have done this, but what I can point out that I thought was super interesting is that in addition to tackling, and forgive me, this is just our sketch, this is not something that the project themselves worked out. They have a couple of different audiences. So one would be community college students, so students at Missouri State and other partner institutions. But if you look down there, another one is another category of students. They ended up expanding and being able to take on students and individuals who are not currently enrolled at community college. So folks will hear about Vesta, and that will be their entry point into an institution that sponsors that program. We thought this was fascinating. It was a real kind of willingness to kind of take people where they are and also to expand the impact of this particular initiative. Another thing to look at, I'm going to see if I can maybe activate one of these little things here, is, oh, and there's even a third category, which isn't here, but it could be. It's third category under students can also be other institutions. I guess these could be these partnerships, but they really are a direct beneficiary because institutions that can't themselves quickly get up to speed and have their own vineyards, do other things, can participate through Vesta and deliver the training while they're building up their own programs. So there's really even a third kind of direct beneficiary of their work. So let's just take a quick look over here at what else is on this spreadsheet. So I'm going to actually go back. This may be distracting. We'll just go back to the regular spreadsheet here and just take a look in general terms. Under communication channels, how will you reach the people once you've identified them? When you're thinking about your own initiative, our recommendation to you is not to fill out too many generic terms here, but to think in a very specific way. If you're reaching out to students on your campus, literally, how would you do that? Is there a newsletter? Is it best to reach them through some kind of bulletin board? Is there a campus-wide alert kind of that you can send out? If it's scholars, is it something that you can send through a society? Or if it's industry, again, is there a professional organization that actually serves as a point of aggregation of all of these entities that you can reach out to? So we encourage you to find very specific communications channels to use in terms of what will your link be to these audience types. And finally, is it worth it? If you look at the two last columns, how large is this segment and how central is it to our mission? You'll start to get some really interesting information. So that's back to the question of, I know I have 10 students here. If I go beyond my institution, how many will I have? How can I find that out? It might be counting number of institutions, doing a rough sample of the number of people enrolled at a handful of them and extrapolating from there. You can sometimes get the size from the communications channels answer. If it's an association, a starting point might be 100% equals the members of that association, and let's imagine how many of those we can get. But then it all comes home to roost with the centrality to mission, and that's where, again, your sense of how well having these people as part of your audience will align to what you're really trying to deliver. But let's go make sure before things get too late, we manage to get beyond these numbers and really talk a bit more about the motivations, because understanding this too is going to help you to make some of the choices. So some of the things you may want to know, besides just how big is the segment, how many, what's it going to contribute maybe financially to us, is really what's driving the people in those segments. And those things may be different, and they almost certainly will be different segment to segment. So what are those people currently doing if they're not participating with you? Where else are they going if they're not participating with you? What do they like about the way things are going now? And how do they wish things could be different? So figuring out exactly what motivates people there is going to start to provide some information that you can act on. So how do you get that information? And this is a very simple one slide on tactics. I'm sure there are other ways. These are some basic tactics to consider. And again, easily would be a very meaty topic to do over several hours because it's not all that easy to do. Focus groups, meaning bringing together and identified members of a certain segment that you're interested in, and having a professional facilitator take them through a conversation and a discussion. So you can start to listen in on what kinds of issues are going to surface. Surveys, again, are wonderful, especially if you need to understand the how big question on certain things. How likely are people to respond this way or that way over a pretty big field? Those can be extremely helpful. They're tricky though. There's an art to survey design. If a question is not actually asked the right way, you risk getting a lot of information that isn't actually that helpful to you. I'm sure that those of you who have ventured a toe in these waters would agree. I wouldn't say it's a bad idea. In certain circumstances, it's a great method. But the one I'd like to stress with you, because it's the one I've seen used the least often, but is the most effective, has to do with in-depth interviewing. And what you might do there is take your segments that you've thought about. I'm going to flip back a couple of slides here again. And when you look at this column about what is the value that this segment considers when they think about your project, there's a lot of ways to get at that. The first question would be, what is your hypothesis about what that value is? And I guarantee everyone can come up with that answer. I think they're coming because they need a better education, they need better training, because they want a job. And that almost certainly is going to be a piece of that answer. But so you use that as a starting point. And as a starting point, you would have a conversation with folks. You would ask to know a little bit more about what it is they do right now, what their aspirations are, how they're doing what they want to do, and what's stopping them from doing things they'd like to do. It's a whole series of questions that you can develop to understand and to surface some of the things that I was able to mention earlier. For example, different market needs that Deirdre Sullivan and Nate are able to meet, that the eBird people were able to figure out. These came from conversations. And so we'd encourage that format for others as well.
Nancy, this is something that I think there was a question earlier that asked about how this all tied in with evaluation, and it seems to me too that you could sort of do a combination as our evaluator has done in the past, where you do a survey and then ask people if they'd be interested in doing follow-up interviews, and that's a great way to sort of work with your evaluator. If you have an external evaluator, have them help you understand audience and your audience needs.
I think that sounds great, and I realize that I'm still learning more and more about exactly what role these evaluators play. It strikes me that they're a really critical part of the team. What I heard from Deirdre yesterday was that the earlier you work with them, the better, and that in the best case, they really do become a full partner. And it sounded a bit like in the best case, they end up almost helping guide PIs through the same sort of process, where you lay out a hypothesis, you figure out ways to test it, and then when there are actual metrics in place, the metrics are based on real evidence, that groundwork of evidence. as opposed to working most of the way through the initiative and then doing kind of an after-action evaluation of how it went. So I think the point is to involve them early and often, is the sense I'm getting. So I wanted to share a couple of extra examples with you about how, what it actually looks like when the audience has been identified and the question is, fine, how do I actually just get them? And I feel like this is an area that where putting theory to practice is really critical for a lot of the folks we've heard from. So just a couple quick examples. The Bridge to Biosciences program at City College of San Francisco actually caught my attention because one of the things that Edie mentioned as a method of bringing people into the program was coordination with an academic counselor on campus. Apparently there are some disciplines that it's never a problem to get people in. They mentioned, I spoke with the academic counselor there, and in certain fields, nursing for example, they find that there's always a long list of people. For the biosciences, they had a little bit more of a challenge, so at some point they were able to obtain a special grant to hire a designated counseling position just to handle biotech, biosciences. And they found that it was so valuable during the grant that they've maintained that position since. And the logic is that that person serves as a pipeline into that program because it's someone who has access to the students on the campus and even someone who has been paying attention to recruiting into the school itself. So the idea of kind of integrating with the different people on campus who each have some role in what that student's experience is seems really, really important. In terms of other cue tactics, in terms of literally how to reach them, it was everything from just setting up appointments with them to putting flyers on car windshields. So the sense I'm getting is that we will, people will do what they need to do, which I think is great. Another interesting case study came to our attention through a workshop we ran earlier this year. The Renewable Energy Program at El Paso Community College focuses on preparing students for jobs that fit the needs of the El Paso area. What we loved about this is that the dean of the program, Dr. Valerio, told us that there was really nothing she would not do. When she realized it was hard, again, to get people into the program, she asked herself, well, what's the profile of the people I'm looking for? These are young people. They want to do what young people want to do. So she went to the local movie theater and placed ads there, literally up on the big screen. And that was a tactic that she found was very useful for her. So I love that because she really took a step back away from where do people go who care about my project, and asked herself, who are the people who care about my, our course and our program? And let's think more broadly about who they are and where they are. And there's no shame in reaching them wherever they are. And I thought that was another terrific example. Another example I came across, I don't have a slide for it, but was just a general piece of advice about thinking about how broadly the course itself can be promoted on the campus, which again means putting it in front of students as often as possible. In this case, the suggestion was looking at cross-listing opportunities. How valid would it be to get cross-listed in another department under general studies or something else, just to maximize the amount of exposure it has. So I love the examples I found. I would love still to hear more examples of people, how they actually in the field are able to do this. But to sum up, just a couple of last words. Impact really does start with audience. Having this impact means a really deep focus on who the impact is intended to support. When you're defining your audience, definitely think broadly at first. Don't limit yourself, but definitely prioritize, because I would not want to be the one leading people into chasing a lot of doing a lot of work for really for nothing. So get the big picture, see how big it can go, but then do the homework and figure out to what extent those different segments are reachable and to what extent will they contribute back. How much is going to cost to even deal with them. get to know the audience really, really well and not just by the numbers. So if you do know this already, great. But if you're not entirely sure, have those conversations about what makes them want to participate. What are they getting out of it? And what do they still need? And then just try a few tactics to see what works. You'll learn all kinds of tactics just from having those conversations. And then the more you can literally put yourself in their path, where they're living, working, playing, the better chance you have of getting that message across. Finally, as Rachel pointed out, the research question is ongoing, so you have to assume that things will change. And so whatever research program you put together, or whatever conversations you're having, will almost certainly not be the last conversations you have. And the more you can standardize that or build it into an ongoing program of user needs understanding, the better. So I'll just share with you a couple of links. We'll have the slide deck available to you through ATE Central. These are just a couple of resources I found that I thought had some interesting examples that you may want to look at. The first one is really just a laundry list of tactics, but the others have a little bit deeper conversation, and specifically on the recruiting question for those of you who care most about that. Before we sign off, I believe we have a final survey to ask you to take. So I'll say thank you and turn it back over to Rachel.
Hi everybody. We wanted to let you know about this next grant, but we also want to launch the survey. So I think that's something that Maytech's team is going to do. There we go. So please help us out. You know how important it is to get impact data. We were just talking about that. So helping us learn about what you found valuable in this webinar, and providing us with a little bit of feedback about it. It looks like it's taking a moment to come up. Our next survey is coming up in April, and you can learn all about that. Okay, there we go. So please go ahead and fill this out. We'll give you a few more minutes to do that. Nancy, did you have any final things that you'd like to add about the next webinar?
Well, I'd just like to really actually extend an invitation. I can say that I feel like I can be the most helpful to you the more I understand you as my audience. And I know that there are even more great examples out there of how folks have worked with identifying different segments. And the next topic up, partnerships, I know that you're out there. So you may just get an email from me, but I would encourage you to actually proactively reach out to me if you'd like to share your examples. I'd be happy to have other people speak on this webinar besides me. And if you're feeling shy, I can also just share the example. But the only point I'd like to make is it's an invitation to get in touch.
Absolutely, and also just to mention too that we are doing a workshop. Our second workshop in this series will be at High Tech in one of the pre-conference workshops on the Monday of High Tech. I can't, at the moment my brain won't retrieve the date, but it's up on AT Central and you can find it on the High Tech site. So we'd love to have any of you that are on the webinar participate in that if you're coming to High Tech too. So I think we're getting close to, everybody should have filled out the survey by now. I'm not seeing any info back from the Maytech folks.
We'll give them about another 10 seconds to wrap up. I'll do a countdown. 10, 9, 8, 7, 6, 5, 4, 3, 2, and 1. Thank you.
Thanks so much, everybody. It was great.
We would like to thank Nancy Marin and Rachel Bauer for joining us. This is the end of our webinar. It is a pleasure to host you today. Thank you for your attendance. Goodbye, everyone.